Berlin, July 20th, 1944. At 12:42 in the afternoon, a bomb went off inside the Wolf's Lair. The Wolf's Lair was Hitler's military headquarters in the forests of East Prussia, a compound of concrete bunkers and wooden barracks and underground facilities buried in the trees near the town of Rastenburg, chosen for its remoteness and its concealment, the specific geography of a man who understood that his continued existence was the primary strategic asset of the German war effort, and who had, across the years of the war, organized his physical location around the management of that asset. It was not a glamorous place. It was a functional place, designed to be difficult to find from the air and difficult to reach by ground, and organized around the specific requirements of running a war from a fixed position in a forest. At 12:42 on July 20th, 1944, a bomb inside a briefcase detonated beneath the conference table in the map room of the Wolf's Lair. The map room was not a bunker. It was a wooden barracks building, a fact of enormous consequence, because the blast that would have been contained and concentrated inside a concrete room was instead dispersed through wooden walls that the explosion simply removed, distributing the force outward rather than channeling it at the men inside. 4 men died. 20 were wounded, several seriously. The man at whose position the briefcase had been placed was not among the dead and was not among the seriously wounded. He had burns to his legs and damage to his eardrums and fragments in his arm and singed hair and the specific physical evidence of having been close to a very large explosion. He was alive. His name was Adolf Hitler. The man who had placed the briefcase and who had walked out of the barracks building and across the compound and boarded a plane to Berlin was, at the moment of the explosion, already in the air. He had placed the briefcase as close to Hitler as he could manage, had found a pretext to leave the room, had walked across the compound and confirmed that he had heard the explosion, and had concluded, on the basis of the size of the explosion, on the basis of the destruction visible from outside the barracks, on the basis of everything he believed about what a bomb of that size in that room would produce, that Adolf Hitler was dead. His name was Klaus von Stauffenberg. He was a colonel in the German army, 36 years old, missing an eye and a hand, and the ring finger and the little finger of his remaining hand from wounds sustained in Tunisia in 1943. He was a man who had arrived at the specific conviction through a process of reasoning that this account will examine, that Hitler's death was the necessary prerequisite for any Germany worth saving, and who had placed the bomb and walked away and flown to Berlin in the belief that the thing had been done. He was wrong. The next 8 hours are the subject of this account. Not the bomb. The bomb has been described many times in the histories and the biographies and the films that have made July 20th, 1944, one of the most documented days in the Second World War. The bomb is the beginning. What followed the bomb is less examined. The 8 hours during which the men in Berlin who had organized the conspiracy operated under the belief that Hitler was dead, issuing orders, making arrests, trying to run a coup in a city that had not received the signal that the coup required before it could proceed, while the man the coup required to be dead was alive in East Prussia, charred and wounded and increasingly furious, and already on the telephone. The 8 hours are the story. The 8 hours are where the coup lived and died, where the conspiracy revealed what it was and what it was not, where the specific combination of careful planning and fatal execution failures and the contingent bad luck of a conference table in a wooden building rather than a concrete bunker produced the outcome that produced everything that followed. The outcome produced the hanging. The outcome produced the wire. The outcome produced the specific, documented, historically precise punishment that the Nazi regime administered to the men who had tried to kill it, and to the men who had not tried but who were connected, and to the men who were connected to the men who were connected, and eventually to the women and the children, and the extended families, in the specific mechanism of collective punishment that the regime applied to treason in the way it applied violence to everything, comprehensively, systematically, without the constraint of proportion. But before the hanging, there were 8 hours. This is the account of those 8 hours. Klaus von Stauffenberg had not always been a conspirator. He had been, for most of his adult life, a professional soldier in the tradition of the Prussian officer class, a man whose family had served the German state for generations, whose formation had been the formation of a professional military with a specific culture of duty and honor and the particular kind of patriotism that a tradition-based military establishment develops over centuries. He had been a cavalry officer, had studied at the Kriegsakademie, had been assessed by his superiors as one of the most gifted officers of his generation. He had not been an early opponent of Hitler. His diaries and letters from the 1930s, examined by historians who have worked through the available documentation, show a man who was not systematically opposed to the Nazi movement and who was not, in the critical years of 1933 and 1934 and 1935, in the ranks of those within the military who were registering principled objection to what was happening to the German state. He was a professional soldier who served the state that existed and whose formation and temperament and professional identity were organized around service rather than political judgment. What changed him was what he saw. He was in Poland in 1939. He was in the Soviet Union in 1941. He saw in both places what the German military was doing to the civilian populations of the countries it occupied, the specific systematic violence against Jewish populations and against the populations designated as racially inferior and against the political categories of person that the regime had decided were enemies, conducted not by the SS alone but with the involvement and the knowledge and sometimes the direct participation of the Wehrmacht units that were present in those territories. He was not immediately converted by what he saw. The conversion was not dramatic and was not sudden, and was not the clean narrative of a man who witnessed an atrocity and in that moment became a different person. It was the slower, more complicated process of a man of genuine moral seriousness confronting the accumulated evidence of what the regime was doing and arriving, through the confrontation, at the conclusion that the regime needed to end and that the ending needed to be organized by people who were in a position to organize it. He was in that position by 1944. His wounds in Tunisia had removed him from field command and deposited him in the administrative structure of the replacement army, the Ersatzheer, the organization responsible for training and equipping the replacement forces that the Eastern Front was consuming at a rate that made the replacement army the most significant military bureaucracy in Germany. He became the chief of staff of the replacement army in June 1944. The position gave him regular access to Hitler's military conferences, access that the conspiracy needed, because the conspiracy needed someone who could get close enough to Hitler to place the bomb. By June 1944, the conspiracy was not new. There had been attempts, at least two serious ones, involving men who had bombs and the proximity to use them and who had failed for reasons of mechanical malfunction or changed itinerary, or the specific contingencies that the killing of a well-protected man in the midst of a world war produces. The conspiracy had a leadership. Colonel General Ludwig Beck, the former chief of the General Staff, who had resigned in 1938 over Hitler's Czech policy and who had maintained, since his resignation, the quiet, careful network of relationships with other senior officers who shared his assessment. Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, who had been building the civilian side of the conspiracy's plans for a post-Hitler Germany since the late 1930s. General Friedrich Olbricht, the head of the General Army Office in Berlin, who controlled the operational machinery through which the coup would be conducted, and there was Operation Valkyrie. Operation Valkyrie was the name given by the regime itself to the contingency plan for the use of the replacement army to maintain order in the event of an internal breakdown, a revolt by the millions of foreign workers inside Germany, or a collapse of civilian order in the bombed cities, or any other emergency that required the rapid mobilization of military force for internal security purposes. It was a legitimate plan, approved by Hitler, designed to address genuine contingencies. Olbricht and the conspirators had modified it. The modified version of Valkyrie would use the replacement army not to maintain the regime's order but to overthrow it, to seize control of the key government buildings and communications centers and military headquarters in Berlin, to disarm the SS, to arrest the Nazi leadership, and to install the provisional government that Goerdeler and Beck had been planning. The plan was careful, was detailed, was organized around the specific institutional mechanisms of the German military in a way that reflected the professional knowledge of the men who had designed it. The plan required one thing above all others: confirmation that Hitler was dead. This was not a logistical requirement in the sense of needing information before proceeding. It was a psychological and political requirement. The men who would carry out the orders of the Valkyrie plan, the officers who would arrest the SS commanders and seize the communication centers and occupy the government buildings, were men who had spent their careers inside a military culture organized around the concept of the oath. They had sworn an oath to Adolf Hitler personally, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, not to any institutional abstraction, but to the man. The oath was not merely a formality. For many of the officers on whose compliance the plan depended, the oath was a genuine moral commitment, and the violation of the oath required the violation of its premise. If Hitler was dead, the oath was dissolved. If Hitler was alive, the men who were supposed to carry out the Valkyrie orders had no framework for doing so that was consistent with the moral architecture of the German officer corps. They would refuse. They would comply with the existing chain of command. They would not arrest the SS commander or seize the communications center. They would do nothing, which was what they had been doing before, which was what the plan needed to overcome. The plan needed Hitler to be dead. Stauffenberg was going to kill him, and then the 8 hours would begin. He flew to Rastenburg on the morning of July 20th with a second bomb. He had carried the first 2 weeks earlier, on July 11th, and had not detonated it because Himmler was not present, and the plan at that point required both Hitler and Himmler to be in the room. He flew with 2 bombs in his briefcase and with his adjutant, Werner von Haften, and with the specific quality of a man who has arrived at the last possible version of the last available attempt, who understands that if this fails there will not be another opportunity. He arrived at Rastenburg. He was given the opportunity to change before the conference, to clean up after the flight, and he used the opportunity to arm one of the bombs in the bathroom, breaking the capsule that began the 10-minute fuse with the 3 remaining fingers of his 1 remaining hand, and leaving the second bomb with Haften. The arming of the second bomb was interrupted by an aide who knocked on the door, asking whether Stauffenberg was ready, and he went to the conference with 1 armed bomb rather than 2. The conference was in the wooden barracks building rather than in the concrete bunker where the summer conferences had been held. The map room was crowded. More than 20 men around the large conference table. Stauffenberg placed his briefcase under the table as close to Hitler as he could manage, and he was called to the telephone. A pretext arranged, and he left the room and walked across the compound. He heard the explosion. He saw the destruction. He crossed to the airfield, brushing through the checkpoints with the specific authority of a man who does not slow down and does not appear to be doing anything other than what a man entitled to leave the compound would be doing. And he and Haften boarded the aircraft waiting for them and flew to Berlin. He called Berlin from the aircraft. He told the conspirators in the Bendler block, the military headquarters building in central Berlin where Ulbricht and the operational machinery of the coup were waiting, that Hitler was dead. The Valkyrie orders needed to go out immediately. The 8 hours needed to begin. They did not begin immediately. This is the first of the fatal failures, and it is the failure that haunts the analysis of July 20th. In all the decades since, the Valkyrie orders were not issued immediately. They were not issued when Stauffenberg called from the aircraft. They were not issued in the window between the explosion at 12:42 and the calls that were beginning to come from Rastenburg, indicating that Hitler might have survived. They were issued finally at approximately 4 p.m., more than 3 hours after the explosion. The reasons for the delay are the subject of dispute in the historical literature, and the dispute is not easily resolved because the people who were in the Bendler block in those 3 hours did not, in their subsequent testimonies, give consistent accounts of what the delay was and why it occurred. Ulbricht's role is particularly examined, whether he acted with sufficient urgency, whether he was waiting for confirmation that Stauffenberg had not provided with sufficient clarity, whether the specific quality of his nerve in the moment was sufficient to the demands of the moment. What is clear is that the 3 hours were the window in which the coup might have succeeded, and in which it did not establish itself with sufficient force and speed to overcome the countermeasures that the surviving Hitler and his loyalists were already organizing. Because Hitler was not dead, the phone calls from Rastenburg reached Berlin within an hour of the explosion. The calls were not from Hitler himself. He was being treated, He was receiving the specific medical attention that a man who has been close to a large explosion requires. He was dealing with the immediate physical consequences of the bomb. But his adjutants and his military staff were on the phones, and the calls they were making established two things with increasing clarity across the afternoon. Hitler was alive and he was furious, and the machinery of the Nazi state was beginning to organize around the fact of his survival. The conspirators in the Bendler bloc were receiving the information from Rastenburg, and they were receiving the information from Stauffenberg, who had landed in Berlin at approximately 3:45 p.m. and who maintained, against the evidence arriving from Rastenburg, that Hitler was dead. He could not accept the alternative, or would not accept it, or was calculating that the coup had to proceed regardless of whether Hitler was alive, because the alternative to proceeding was exposure and death, and exposure and death were going to come whether the coup succeeded or not, and proceeding was the only path that offered any possibility of the outcome the coup was designed to produce. He was right about the last part. Exposure and death were coming. But the proceeding could not succeed if Hitler was alive, and the Valkyrie orders were going to the commands of the replacement army with instructions to arrest the SS and seize government buildings, and the SS commanders who received the orders were simultaneously receiving countermanding instructions from the still living Führer's still operating command structure, and the officer who was supposed to arrest the SS commander in his own headquarters and who received both sets of instructions was going to follow the one that had Hitler behind it rather than the one that claimed Hitler was dead. The 3 hours mattered. By the time the Valkyrie orders went out, the communication channel from Rastenburg was established, and the men who were supposed to carry out the orders had the countervailing information that the orders depended on them not having. The plan required them to believe Hitler was dead. The plan required the Valkyrie orders to arrive before the countermanding instructions. The plan required speed, and the 3 hours had consumed the speed. And what remained was a coup running in Berlin against the information that Hitler was alive in East Prussia. The coup ran anyway. It ran for the 8 hours with the specific quality of a machine that has been set in motion and that cannot easily be stopped even when the conditions for its success have been removed, because the men in the Bendler bloc had committed themselves to a course of action that had no safe reversal, and because Stauffenberg specifically was a man whose specific quality was the quality of the man who proceeds when proceeding is the only available option. They sent the orders. They arrested, briefly, the commander of the Berlin garrison. They occupied, briefly, some government buildings. They issued instructions to the military commands in France and in Denmark and in other theaters that reached some of those commands and produced, in Paris, the most successful implementation of the plan outside Berlin, where the military commander, General Karl von Stülpnagel, arrested the entire Paris SS and Gestapo, several hundred men, in a sweep conducted with the efficiency of a military operation organized by men who believed the coup was succeeding. In Berlin, the efficiency was not the same. The critical communications center, the radio station that the Valkyrie plan required to be seized, and that was supposed to broadcast the announcement of Hitler's death and the installation of the new government, was not seized. The propaganda ministry, which controlled the communications that the German population was receiving, was not seized. The men responsible for seizing them did not carry out the orders, for reasons that the subsequent accounts do not fully clarify, which reflects the general quality of the afternoon in the Bendler bloc, the quality of men trying to run a coup without the central premise of the coup being true. Goebbels was still in his ministry. He had been in Berlin when the bomb went off, and he had received in the hours after the explosion the contradictory information that was reaching everyone in Berlin who was trying to understand what had happened and what was happening. He received information that Hitler was dead. He received information that Hitler was alive. He received the Valkyrie orders as they went out, and he received countermanding instructions from Rastenburg, and he made a decision. He called Hitler. Hitler was available to be called. He was in East Prussia, wounded and furious and increasingly organized around the specific task of crushing the coup that was being conducted in his name in Berlin. He had been on the phone with various people. He had been told what was happening in Berlin, and he was directing the countermeasures that his surviving loyalists were implementing. The instructions to the military commands to disregard the Valkyrie orders, the organization of the SS response, the preparation of the broadcast that would demonstrate to Germany that the Führer was alive. Goebbels arranged for Otto Ernst Remer, the the major commanding the Guard battalion in Berlin, the officer whose unit had been given orders as part of the Valkyrie plan, and who was in the specific position of a man who has received orders from the conspiracy and who does not know whether to follow them, to speak directly to Hitler on the telephone. Raymer spoke to Hitler. Hitler promoted him on the telephone from major to colonel and instructed him to crush the revolt in Berlin. Raymer, who had the oath and who now had the living Führer on the telephone promoting him and giving him orders, knew what to do. He did it. The units that had been following the Valkyrie orders began to receive countermanding instructions. The men who had been arresting SS officers began to release them. The brief, partial, geographically limited implementation of the plan began to collapse in the specific way that a plan collapses when its central premise is revealed to be false, not dramatically, not with a single moment, but through the accumulation of reversals that each produced the next reversal until the reversals had consumed the plan entirely. The conspirators in the Bendler block understood as the evening arrived that it was over. Some of them tried to leave. Some were arrested by officers loyal to the regime. Ulbricht was arrested. Beck attempted to shoot himself in the Bendler block and wounded himself but did not die and was shot by a sergeant. Fromm, the commander of the replacement army who had been arrested by the conspirators early in the afternoon because he had declined to support the coup, and who had therefore spent several hours as a prisoner in his own headquarters, was released and immediately convened a court-martial, the most summary possible proceeding, to execute the men who had arrested him before they could be interrogated and implicate him in the conspiracy that he had known about and had declined to stop. Stauffenberg was in the Bendler block when the Loyalists arrived in force. He was shot in the courtyard of the Bendler block at approximately 12:30 a.m. on July 21st, 12 hours after the bomb, by a firing squad organized by Fromm. He was shot with Ulbricht and with Haften and with one other officer. Haften threw himself in front of Stauffenberg as the guns fired and was killed first. Stauffenberg was hit and called out, "Long live Holy Germany," or so the account preserves his last words, and was shot again and died in the courtyard. Fromm's attempt to execute the men before they could be interrogated and implicate him did not work. He was arrested within days and executed in 1945. The executions that followed July 20th lasted for months. Hitler had survived. Hitler had survived, and the system that protected him and that he was the center of was now organized with the specific fury of a man who has been almost killed and has survived, and who understands that the people who tried to kill him are inside the system he runs, around the task of finding them. The investigation was conducted by the Gestapo, by Ernst Kaltenbrunner's RSHA, by the special commission that Hitler established under the direction of Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo, whose specific investigative method was the interrogation of everyone connected to the conspiracy until the connections had been fully mapped and every connection had been addressed. The connections were extensive. The conspiracy had been larger than most people outside it had known, had been building for years, had included men at the highest levels of the German military and civil service and professional and intellectual life, men who had been associated with the conspiracy at various distances, who had known about it or had been approached about it or had approved of it in principle without participating in it operationally, who were connected to the conspirators by friendship or family or professional association or shared political position. The Gestapo found them. The executions were conducted at Plötzensee prison in Berlin. The method was hanging on meat hooks with piano wire, and the hangings were filmed on Hitler's orders so that he could watch them. The film exists in the historical record. The decision to film them, the specific decision of a man who had survived the attempt on his life and who wanted to watch the deaths of the men who had attempted it, is in the historical record as one of the documents of what the man was. Between the July 20th attempt and the end of the war in May 1945, approximately 200 people were executed for their involvement in the conspiracy or their connection to its members. The number includes senior military figures, civil servants, diplomats, lawyers, theologians, trade unionists, the civilian planners of the post-Hitler Germany who had spent years thinking about what a Germany without Hitler could look like. It includes Karl Goerdeler, who was executed in February 1945. It includes Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, who who had known about the conspiracy and had not stopped it. It includes men whose connection to the July 20th plot was remote and whose execution reflected the specific logic of a regime that was conducting a war against its own internal enemies with the same totality it was conducting the war against its external ones. The families were arrested and sent to camps under the Sippenhaft principle, the liability of the family for the crimes of its member, the specific extension of punishment beyond the individual to the collective of blood relation that the regime had developed as an instrument of terror and now applied to the families of the conspirators. Stauffenberg's wife was arrested. His children were taken and placed in a home under false names. His brothers were arrested. The mechanism of Sippenhaft produced, alongside the executions of the conspirators themselves, hundreds of additional arrests and imprisonments of people whose crime was biological proximity to the man who had placed the briefcase. The question that the 8 hours produce, the question that the historical analysis of July 20th has been organized around since the war, is the question of whether it could have succeeded and what failure would have required and what success would have meant. On the could have succeeded question, the historical analysis is not uniform. The counterfactual involves the wooden building rather than the concrete bunker, which is documented and is the most frequently cited mechanical contingency, but also involves the 3-hour delay and the failure to seize the communications center and the failure to prevent Goebbels from calling Rastenburg and the specific decision by Rehmer to follow the living Führer rather than the orders of men claiming the Führer was dead. Each of these contingencies altered produces a different trajectory. The concrete bunker is the most often cited because it is the most clearly mechanical. If the conference had been in the concrete bunker where the winter conferences were held, the bomb would have killed everyone in the room and there would have been no need for the 3 hours to work because the premise would have been established beyond dispute. But the concrete bunker is not the only contingency that matters. The 3-hour delay mattered. The failure to seize the communications center mattered. The Rehmer phone call mattered. What the cumulative analysis shows is a plan that had a window, a specific time-bounded window in which the conditions for success were present, and that failed to act with sufficient speed and decisiveness to occupy the window before the countermeasures closed it. The window was the period between the explosion and the establishment of reliable communication from Rastenburg that Hitler was alive. In that window, if the Valkyrie orders had gone out, if the communications center had been seized, if the broadcast announcing Hitler's death had reached the German military before the countermanding instructions from Rastenburg, the coup might have created a fait accompli that the loyalists could not reverse. It did not occupy the window. On the question of what success would have meant, whether a Germany that had removed Hitler in July 1944 would have been a better Germany, would have ended the war sooner, would have produced a different outcome for the millions of people who died between July 1944 and May 1945. The historical analysis is more complex and more honest than the moral mythology of the resistance sometimes allows. The men who were planning the post-Hitler Germany were not Democrats in the straightforward sense. Goebbels' plans for a post-Hitler Germany included a strong executive, limited popular sovereignty, a restricted franchise, a conservative social order organized around traditional institutions rather than liberal democratic principles. They were men of the German conservative tradition who wanted Germany without Hitler, but did not want Germany in the form that the liberal West was eventually going to impose on it after the unconditional surrender of May 1945. They wanted to negotiate. They wanted a Germany that ended the war on terms that preserved some element of German sovereignty, that avoided the unconditional surrender that the Allied powers had insisted upon since Casablanca. They wanted the Western Allies to deal with a post-Hitler German government as a partner in the containment of the Soviet threat rather than as a defeated enemy to be occupied and reformed. The Western Allies had said repeatedly and clearly that they would not negotiate with any German government, that they would accept only unconditional surrender, that the removal of Hitler was not a sufficient condition for a different peace. The conspirators either did not fully believe this or believed they could change it by demonstrating that they were different from the regime they had removed. Whether they were right, whether a successful July 20th coup would have produced a different response from the Western Allies, whether the Allied insistence on unconditional surrender was firm enough to survive the political reality of a coup that replaced Hitler with a government of German conservatives who were willing to end the war, is not a question the historical record can answer, because the question asks what would have happened if the thing that did not happen had happened. What happened is this: the bomb went off in a wooden building and Hitler walked away. The 8 hours ran their course and the Valkyrie plan collapsed, and Stauffenberg was shot in the courtyard at midnight. The Gestapo swept through the connections and the executions ran from July through April 1945. The war continued for 10 months. The 10 months killed approximately 3 million German soldiers and millions of civilians and millions of people in the concentration camps and in the occupied territories and in the cities that were bombed and the armies that were fought. The 10 months are in the record after the 8 hours as the measure of the 8 hours' failure. Stauffenberg's name is on a street in Berlin. There is a monument at the Bendler block where he was shot. There is a museum in the building where the 8 hours happened. There is a German national holiday associated with the date. Germany has organized, in the decades since the war, a specific relationship to the memory of July 20th, a relationship that treats the conspiracy as the evidence that another Germany existed within the Third Reich, that the military and professional class produced men who saw what was happening and tried to stop it, that the resistance was real. The relationship is not false. The resistance was real. The men were real. The attempt was real. The bomb was also placed in a wooden building rather than a concrete bunker, and the Valkyrie orders were delayed for 3 hours, and the communications center was not seized, and Goebbels called Rastenburg, and Raymer answered the phone. The 8 hours happened the way they happened. The 10 months happened after them. The record holds all of it. The briefcase and the barracks and the 3 hours and the piano wire and the Sippenhaft and the films that Hitler watched, without resolving it into the clean narrative that either the mythology of heroic resistance or the analysis of tragic failure tends to produce. It was both. It was both. And the both is the record. And the record is what the 8 hours left behind. The bomb went off at 12:42. Hitler walked away. Stauffenberg flew to Berlin. The 8 hours began. The 8 hours ended in a courtyard. The war continued for 10 months. The 10 months are the cost of the 8 hours. The record holds them all.